Good evening, and thank you for joining us. My name is Chrissy, and I would like to welcome you to the Doylestown Bookshop's virtual event series. We are thrilled to welcome author Don Bentley as he discusses his new book, Tom Clancy Target Acquired, the eighth book in the Jack Ryan Jr. series, which will be released tomorrow, with #1 New York Times bestselling author Jack Carr. Our guests will be in conversation for about 30 minutes. After that, they will take questions from you, the viewers. If you would like to submit a question, please click on Ask a Question on your screen and enter your question there. If you're on a phone or tablet, click the icon with the question mark to submit your questions. If you would like to purchase Tom Clancy Target Acquired or The Devil's Hand from the Doylestown or Lahaska Bookshop, click the button on your screen that says Buy the Books. We have curbside pickup available at both of our locations, and we ship worldwide. The first 50 readers to purchase their copy of Tom Clancy Target Acquired from our bookshops will receive a signed book plate from Don Bentley with their order. I'm so happy to introduce these guys. This is very exciting. Don Bentley spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, and while deployed in Afghanistan, was awarded the Bronze Star and the Air Medal with V Device for Valor. Following his time in the military, Bentley worked as an FBI special agent focusing on foreign intelligence and counterintelligence, and was a SWAT team member. Don is the author of the Matt Drake thriller series, including Without Sanction, The Outside Man, and 2 forthcoming titles. Jack Carr is a #1 New York Times bestselling author and former Navy SEAL. He is the author of The Terminal List, True Believer, and Savage Son. You can visit him at officialjackcarr.com and follow him on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Jack Carr USA. Hello, gentlemen, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my goodness, thanks
Thank you for having us.
Awesome. Yeah, excited.
Woo! Well, I'm going to let you two get to it, and I'll see you for the Q&A.
All right.
Thanks, Chrissy.
No problem.
So cool, man. It's so awesome to see you. Thank you for asking me to do this. Such an honor. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thanks, dude. It's great to see you again. And I congratulated you once before, but I want to say it on the record. Way to go for the #1 New York Times bestseller. That's awesome, dude. Super stoked for you.
Man, I appreciate that. It's been a crazy couple of years, that's for sure. And for you too. I mean, Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Jr. series, that is crazy. I want to talk all about that. But since we're buddies, I didn't write anything down. But a lot of my questions tonight, I think, are going to center around how on earth you managed to write 2 novels. It seems like we were just talking about this like yesterday.
Yes.
It seems like yesterday anyway that I was just reading this thing to prepare for talking to you about that. And then all of a sudden there's another book out. So how on earth, before I want to go into a little bit of background and how you got to this point.
Sure.
Because I want to make sure I get it in. So I've learned from interviews to start with what you want to make sure you get in, because you never know where you're going to go after that. So
where it's going to go, could go anywhere.
During COVID, with probably family in the house, like how on earth did you write 2 novels during this time frame?
I didn't sleep for most of the, no, that's not true. It was, so when my editor is Tom Colgan for both books, which is fantastic and helps me out quite a bit. And so when he originally asked me to do the Tom Clancy book, The Target Acquired, it was during our editorial call for The Outside Man. And as you know, but maybe some of the readers don't, the editorial call, when you're a writer, it's the, stomach in your throat. Like, that's when you finally get to talk to your editor about the book and figure out whether they liked it or not. And so it's kind of a fun call to go to, but kind of like, being in 4th grade and wondering if you did your homework right again. And so we had a great call for The Outside Man. And at the end of it, Tom Colgan is very much did his Columbo interpretation. So as I thought we were about to end the call, he said, by the way, one more question for you. Would you like to write, the Tom Clancy Target, well, then it didn't have a title, but the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. one. And, after I picked my jaw back off the floor, I'm like, of course I would. And then I had to try and figure out how that would work. And so luckily for me, my fabulous agent, Barbara Powell, has always beaten into me that when you finish a book, you immediately start the next book. So you immediately start, you don't gloat, you don't feel good for yourself. She's not really into anybody feeling good for themselves. And she's like, write the next book. So I had already started writing the next Matt book as we went back and forth on what the Tom Clancy book was going to be. And so I had maybe 20 or 30,000 words of that Matt book before Target Acquired was finalized and the deal, and then I had to shift gears. So I really had about 9 or 10 months or so to write Target Acquired, which isn't the full year, but it isn't a book every 6 months like what Brad Taylor and Mark Greaney and guys like that, Mark Cameron, did. So I shaved it off a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. But man, when I handed that sucker in February of this year, so I handed Target Acquired in 2021, and obviously it comes out tomorrow. I jumped back into the third Matt book, which is called Hostile Intent, and that is due on 15th July. And so then the whole holy crap, writing a book every 6 months came into play, because you're doing edits for one book, you're trying to write another book. The publicity folks are fantastic, but they're feeding you interviews and stuff to do. So it really has been the last 6 months where I've completely lost my mind. So after July 15th, when I turned in Hostile Intent, then you can ask me how I did it, because to be honest, I'm not sure just yet. So that's my disclaimer.
Well, I'll ask you for sure next time we talk, which when we talk about your next book, it'll be the next Matt Drake one, right? And so
yes,
then I can
that's
ask
right.
you, okay, and which and that one will come out next year, early 2022 sometime.
Yep, May of 2022, I think.
Okay, so then I'll get to ask you. I'll ask you before then personally, but then we'll talk about it in an interview.
Yes,
around that time.
yes.
Because I know that it's I could not do the 2 a year. It's just, oh my gosh, you have to be so disciplined to be able to get that done, and it's just insane that you're pulling this off. So well done, my friend.
Thank you. It's a little crazy, but honestly, I joke about it. But I'm lucky enough to be friends with both Brad Taylor and Mark Greaney, who have both done it before. And so I picked both of their friends, and I've made this joke before. You got Mark Greaney on one side, that's like the good angel, and he's like, "You can do it. You just have to. You can do it." And then Brad Taylor's like, "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. You might die." And so between the two of them, I kind of figured out I'd try and give it a whirl. But yes, very much in the thick of it right now.
Oh, that's hilarious. That's Elias and Barnes, for those that are out there that are movie fans. Like I know you are. From your book.
Well played. Well
that's
played.
Right, because you do have a thing. There's some movie references in here in Outside Man, and there's one in here I wanted to ask you about last time, but
yeah.
And it said, if it had been a run-of-the-mill shoot-'em-up flick, an element of seals with gelled hair and designer sunglasses would have been on the other side. So I don't earmark books, but I did in this case. So next time we talked, I could bring that up. Tell you that I used to resemble that remark, not so much anymore.
So I have to tell you that my son is 19, and we've been going through kind of old 80s stuff. And so I pulled out for him the cinematic masterpiece known as Act of Valor. And we watched that. And I have to tell you, like, watching those, as much as everybody's like, they just, like, those scenes are some of the best cinematic scenes I've ever seen. And like watching it again, the opening portion where the fast boat's coming in and they're jumping in the water and stuff. And I'm like, I know as an Army guy, I'm not supposed to like SEALs, but I might want to be a SEAL right now, just for this short moment in time, just right now. But I might be a SEAL right now. So I have to give you that.
They did a good job with that, coming in on those boats and having the miniguns.
Mm-hmm.
Like that was pretty
Yeah.
Yeah, one of my buddies that was in that is actually the technical advisor on the Terminal List. That's why I just saw.
Oh, that's awesome.
And
that's awesome.
Through that movie, he got into it, and then did Lone Survivor and done a bunch of other stuff.
Very cool.
Fantastic.
Very cool.
So how many people have done the Jack Ryan Jr. up to this point? What are you inheriting at this stage?
Man, you're going to stump me this early on. So here's what I'll tell you is that I know the folks that have done it before are Mike Madden, who did a tremendous job with the series before me, and his last book was Firing Point. And then Mark Greaney as well did them, and I believe did one of the first ones. So Mark had the honor of writing with Tom when Tom was still alive, and then wrote one of the first, if not the first two, I can't remember, after Tom had passed. And Mark wrote both. So the way that the Clancy universe works is there are 2 book series that happen in parallel, and they happen every 6 months. So in the winter book, it is the Jack Ryan Sr. book that Mark Cameron writes now. And then the summer book is the Jack Ryan Jr. that I do, and they stagger and go. And so Mark Greaney actually went from one to another and did both of those. And I don't know if any of the other writers did that as well. But besides the 3 of them, also Grant Blackwood did I don't know if he did both or just did the Jack Ryan Sr. ones. And I believe there's another author as well. But the only three guys I know of that universe are Mark Cameron, who's still writing now, Mike Madden, like I said, that did an amazing job that I got to take up after, and then Mark Graney, who's kind of done everything Clancy. And all of those guys are such fantastic folks, nothing but supportive. When I got the opportunity to take this over and bend over backwards time and time again to help me doing this. I can't, and I assume the rest of the Clancy writers are the same way. I just don't know them, but those three guys are just fantastic folks.
And when you first got this, when Tom Colgan asked you to do this and you said yes, and then you hang up the phone, what do you do after that? Do you dive right in and start doing some research, or did you read all the books, or did you take notes? I know, did Mark give you that Bible of stuff, or like what did you do as far as that research yourself in that world, and then like strategically? And then tactically, what did you do to make sure that you got like the eye color of a recurring character right, and all that sort of thing?
So to be honest, when he first asked me to do it, I told him I needed to talk to my wife and think about it, because I knew I was still working my day job there. I had my own series going at the same time. And I remember I came home and told my wife. And so Ange and I are high school sweethearts. We've been together forever. She's read probably everything that I've ever written and is my first reader, and is really, really good sounding board for a lot of different things, but certainly for writing stuff. And I'm like, hey, I got this amazing opportunity, but I don't know that I can do it. I think I'm going to say no. And she's like, you're going to do what? And I said, well, look, we've got kids. I have 3 kids that are 19, 17, and 14, where I was like, I can't do both of these. And she's like, family meeting. And so she calls family meeting. The kids come in and she's like, Dad got the opportunity to write a Tom Clancy book, and he's thinking about saying no. Put it to a vote. And they're all like, you have to write it. This is your dream. And so it was super, super cool of them. And we kind of came to an agreement as a family, like, this is what it's going to mean for the next year for Dad, as he's trying to do this and do a full-time job and everything at the same time. And so I was kidding about it before, but I called up Mark Graney and talked to him about it. And he was super in the beginning. He said, I'm not going to try and talk you into this. I'm going to tell you about how it really is, and you can make the decision, but I'm not going to tell you you have to do it. And by the end of the phone call, he's like, you have to do this. This is the biggest opportunity. Nice. And so, after that, and then getting kind of the great feedback from everybody, I called Tom back and said, thank you so much. And I'm very interested in doing this. And then when you hang up the phone, that's when your stomach just clenches up for the first time, because, I know you've talked quite a bit about how important David Morrell was for you, both in your choice to become a SEAL and your desire to be a writer in particular, First Blood and his series. Tom Clancy was very much that for me. When I was 13 or 14 years old, my neighbor friend down the street came up and he put this mammoth book in my hands, and he's like, you've got to read this book. And it was Red Storm Rising. And I remember reading that book and being, not just transported, because it's a story and Tom had that gift, but there's a scene early on in that book where there's an F-14 and it's doing gun runs on this Russian tanker that's full of mechanized armor that's going to take over. And I just remember putting that section down and think, I would have sworn 5 minutes ago I'm sitting in the cockpit of that F-14, because Tom could do that. And so those were the things that are running through my head when I said yes, is, man, what do I have to live up to? Not just Tom Clancy himself, but the guys like Mark Graney and Mark Cameron and Mike Madden, who'd done such a fantastic job before me. And this was, as much as I teased Tom Colgan, there were several times where I got, would send him texts about stuff that are kind of saying, maybe you got the wrong guy, without actually coming out and saying you got the wrong guy. And he is such a great buffer for that. And what he came back to me when I said yes, and he's like, look, I want you to hear me. Your job is not to be Tom Clancy. Nobody can be Tom Clancy. He said, your job, he said, I picked you because I like the way you write and what you're doing for your Matt Drake series. And so your job is to write the way you write in Tom's universe, and that's it. And he's like, you're not trying to be Tom Clancy. You're not trying to write in Tom Clancy's style. You're trying to be you in that universe. And so that took some pressure off. And then the other thing, in the industry, Tom Colgan is famous, among other things, for picking the exact writer that's perfect for a series. And so he picked, I think his name is Brian. I forget his last name. I'm sorry, Brian, and then Josh Hood to do the Bourne Legacy stuff. He picked the Andrews and Wilson guys to do the W.B. Griffin stuff. He picked all the Clancy guys, and he said, I picked you. You're the right guy. You don't have to worry about that because I only picked the right guys. And that was, tremendously reassuring as I set about to do this. But then what I really wanted to do is as I came to this particular book, is said there have been some fantastic things that people have done with this series. And what I want to do is take a moment and kind of go back to my first love and try and remember what it was about Tom Clancy books that so captivated me when I was just a kid starting out to read those. And so I got a bunch of the old books. Some of them I had, some of them I had to go find, like Cardinal in the Kremlin, or The Sum of All Fears, or Debt of Honor, and all those. And I started reading them. And I kept a notebook that literally the page was titled Cool Things Clancy Does. And I would just write down, I'm like, because another thing I think Tom does so well is he brings candy for the readers. Like, he puts scenes in there that certainly move the story along, but they're just scenes, from whether it's sitting on the bridge of a 688, attack sub, or watching as Mary Pat at a hockey game, Mary Pat Foley, does a brush pass with her asset in front of the KGB. Like, those are things that the readers just love, and just love to be able to experience that stuff that you've always heard about, that you are now sitting, hypothetically or metaphorically in the front seat of that F-14. And so I wrote as many of those as I could down. And then when I started to bring the book together, I looked for ways to put those in. And there was, and this book is by far the most complicated one I've ever written in my life. And there were, times where I had the final climax of it, the last 75 pages or so, there's probably 5 different points of view that all intersect in that climax with different events. And so there was, at one point, I had note cards the entire length of my office floor trying to synchronize all that stuff. And there were, a time where I thought, I'm not going to be able to pull this off. I should just cut out this sequence completely. And then I thought, you know what? How many times in your life do you get the chance to write a Tom Clancy book? His freaking name's going to be on that cover. And if it kills me, I'm going to try and do this. And so that was kind of my attitude going into it. The other part, because Tom Colgan is very much the whisperer to you, is he told me once, he said, the difference in his opinion between a good writer and a great writer, and he used Mark Graney as this example because Mark is such a fantastic writer, is that a great writer is never satisfied to write the same book again. They're always pushing themselves in one way or another. And Mark does that with every book he did. And 1 Minute Out, he did that by switching point of views from third person to first person point of view. And so every time I would waffle a little bit, every time I'd think, I don't know if I can do this, I kind of had on one side, this is a freaking Tom Clancy book and you better pony up. And then the other side, Tom Colgan whispering, great writers push themselves. And so that is kind of the crucible that this book was formed in.
That's awesome. I feel like I need to have a family meeting because I feel like the opposite happened in this house. Oh my God!
Let Ange talk to your wife. She'll tell you all about family
actually,
meetings.
Anytime. That's just happened the last year and a half now. Oh but actually, I was listening to Lee Child on the Crew Reviews podcast with Andrew Child, who's taking over the series now, and they were asking him about what he's looking forward to, and he said, "I'm looking forward to just reading again."
Yeah.
And so that was like the first thing that he said when they asked him about what are you going to do in retirement type thing. He said, turning this over to my brother, and I am going to read. That's this most. I feel that a little bit of that as well, especially with some of those earlier books like you just mentioned, like going back to Red Storm Rising, especially for Clancy fans who have just read the Jack Ryan and the Jack Ryan Jr. stuff and haven't read Red Storm Rising because it is kind of that one-off and it's a little older and came after Hunt for Red October. But wow, what a book! I remember reading it too back in that same time frame. Maybe it was 8th grade or so, right after maybe 7th. But what an amazing book! And I want to reread it, but right now that's serious. For those who have read it, you know how thick that book is. You can double it up and use it as a blunt impact weapon or a doorstop if you need to, because it's such a long novel. But it's so good. Like it is. I mean,
Yeah.
I might go out on a limb and say it might be one of my favorite Tom Clancy novels. But I
And
mean,
it launched me. Like, that was the golden age of these epic military thrillers. So there was Red Storm Rising. There was Larry Bond that wrote Red Phoenix for North Korea. Harold Coyle wrote Team Yankee. You know, Dale Brown wrote his first books around that same time. The guy that you've talked about as well, Craig, forget his last name, that wrote Firefox and stuff like that. Like, that was a golden age right then of these epic, sprawling military thrillers. And Red Storm Rising was the one that turned me on to all of those.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I'm looking forward to going back, but I hesitate for some of them because I have such great memories reading them in like 1984, 85, 86, 87, 88.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I don't know if I want to go back through all these intervening years, all these different filters that have now been put, you know, between that time reading it with such probably innocence and open eyes and excitement, and then today. So I'm not at that point yet where I can quite sit down and just lie in a hammock and read that novel again. But one day I will, and I'm certainly looking forward to that day. And so for more on the tactical side of the house, then, like when you were looking for, didn't want to mess up, you know, what car someone drove, or what color their hair was, or, you know, who their husband or wife was, what's their name, or how do you spell that name? Because it's hard with your own books to try to do that. And I'm only on number 4, and I have them all stacked next to me at this point. So I go back, I'm like, what color was so-and-so's hair? How do you spell that name? You know, I don't have that Bible written yet, which I need to do, by the way. But how did you do that? How did you do those more tactical level descriptions?
So 2 things. So Mark Greaney did, and, you know, we've joked about the Bible before. When he took over the series, he went through, and I think it was Teeth of the Tiger, maybe, and I may be getting the title wrong, but he went through and took Post-it notes in every single page of that book that had something that was somebody's last name, somebody's wife, their brother, their color hair, and he just stuck a Post-it note on all of those. Now, what Mark did not do was consolidate said Post-it notes into an actual Bible that
come on, Mark. What's
which
going
is,
on?
I know. Jeez. Between writing 6 books a year, you think the least he could do was have made that Bible for me.
Seriously.
And so this is where I used my children as slave laborers. I paid my 14-year-old, I think, $10 an hour. And I said, go through and everywhere Mr. Greaney tagged a page, try and figure out why it's important and put it into a sheet for me. And so she helped me create the Bible. Which when I am no longer writing in the Clancy universe, I will auction to the highest bidder. And so she made that for me. And so that helped out tremendously. The other thing is Tom Colgan is very much the guardrail of the series. And so maybe not, he knows a whole lot of what happened and to when, and plot points that had happened before. And so when you're spitballing what the plot is going to be, he's a huge asset because he can come in and say, no, we've done this before, or, hey, that's good, but it's a little too close to this. Maybe try and tweak this a little bit. And it sounded very much, one of my good friends, actually, 2 of them, Graham Brown and Boyd Morrison, both wrote with Clive Cussler and described similar things, where Clive was this repository of knowledge for everything that spanned that series. And so they would go in. Graham tells a funny story about going in with this great idea, and Clive was like, nope. 5 books ago, series 3, already did that. Try again, Graham. And so Tom, you know, was the asset that helped you do that. But then the other thing that's maybe just as important, if not more important, is he's the wealth of knowledge for how a character thinks, what they've done before, who they interact with. And so there's part of it, you know, in writing my own series, the Matt Drake series, there was something I had to guard against the entire time, is Matt slipping into Jack Ryan Jr. or vice versa. And so there's a scene in the book where Jack Ryan has to talk to John Clark about something. And the first version of that, Jack Ryan Jr. was maybe a little bit more snippy than what the situation merited. And that's where Tom Colgan just put the smack down, and he's like, Jack Ryan Jr. would never talk to John Clark that way. Take it out. And so he was very much, like I said, the entire process, even as daunting as it was, I just felt backstopped the entire way, whether it was from Tom Colgan, whether it was from my fellow authors, even Mike Madden. You know, he did a great job with the series and Firing Point. His last one was incredible, but all the time he's like, man, you can do this. You can do this. Tom wouldn't have chosen you. He's like, I know what you're feeling right now. You can do this. And that was just the incredible part of all of this is not only do you get to do the equivalent for a thriller writer of writing in the Star Wars universe, but everybody else who writes in that universe is standing up there to freaking pat you on the back, help you point in the right direction, tell you can do it. And it was just incredible.
Oh, that's awesome. I love it. And before we go into questions, I want to ask you, I should probably ask you what this book is about. Like, what is it? Did you come up with it and pitch the idea to Tom and then tweak it? Or did he say, did he give an idea to spark it, or you just total blank slate, or how did that come about?
So the way it works for the Clancy books is that you and Tom Colgan kind of talk about ideas and plot ideas, and then you write up a synopsis that the Clancy Foundation, approves, and then you go write the book. Now, I write very organically, and so I don't plot my books ahead of time. And I had this discussion with Tom, and I'm like, look, here's what I know is going to happen, and here's what I think. Well, I'll tell that in a second. And I said, here's kind of what my idea is. I'll certainly do the synopsis, but I can't guarantee that it's going to stick to that. And he's like, no, that's fine. We as a publisher have built this incredible relationship with the Clancy Foundation, and they trust us because we've done a great job. And he said, so you write how you write and it's going to be fine. And so what was funny about it is right about, so I had to turn in Target Acquired in February. And so right about December or so, the UK does their own version of the cover of the book. And so Tom emailed me and he said, hey, that 4-page synopsis that you did a year ago, I'm going to send it to them so that they can do the cover of their book. And I know some things have probably changed because you write more organically. So of those 4 pages, how much of it is still good? And so I took a look at it and I said, about the first paragraph is still good. None of the rest of it is still accurate. And so he was very good with that and was fine with it. And so that's kind of how it worked from a macro level. From a micro level, what I really wanted to do coming inside this as a writer was to neck it down and me to spend most of my mind in Jack Ryan Jr.'s head. And for a couple reasons. One, because as a new writer or a writer that's new to the series, I felt it was my duty to crawl inside his head and understand what he's thinking about and understand what makes him tick. And the best way for me to do that was to zero down the focus of the book to be more him. The second thing is, one of the times when I was talking with Tom Colgan, he said that he and Mark Cameron, when they were talking about one of the Jack Ryan Sr. books, came up with this thesis that said, Jack Ryan Sr. is president of the United States, and there's certainly a lot of benefits that come with presidents of the United States. And they said, what if we came up with a scenario in which being the president was to the detriment to Jack Ryan Sr.? What if being the president hamstrung him? What could we line up for that? And so I kind of grabbed hold of that like a pit bull and said, could I do the same thing with Jack Ryan Jr., where I neck it down just to his focus, and the assets that he normally relies on to get a job done aren't available to him? Could I come up with that kind of scenario? And so that's very much how Target Acquired came about. And it starts with an asset validation exercise. And so I was an FBI agent and I was a human guy, which meant that it was my job to run and recruit what we call sources and what folks in the intelligence community call assets. And when you're looking at somebody that's potentially a source, and so the reason why you're trying to recruit them is because you need information. And that information could be for an ongoing case. It could be because you want to know something about the Free Syrian Army. It could be because you want to know something about a WMD program. And so when you're looking at them to evaluate them as a potential source or an asset, you're kind of looking at a couple things. One, do they have access to the information you want? 2, what is it that they want? Because obviously this is going to be kind of a two-way relationship. And the third one is kind of, are they trainable? And so what that means is that you as the handler or case officer, if you're in the intelligence community, you're going to train them to do the job of a spy, basically. And so when you're looking at someone and trying to evaluate that, a lot of times what you might do is set up what's called an asset validation exercise. So you're going to give them a tasking that they think is real, that is not real, and is solely designed to evaluate, are they suitable or not? And so you might have role players, you might have other folks who are in there to do it, because you don't, if you have any doubt whatsoever of this person that you're about to use as an asset, you certainly don't want to find out they're not trainable when it's for real, right? Because then there are lives on the line and information at stake. And so having, some experience with that as an FBI special agent, I always had this thought when we would talk about asset or source validation exercises is what if something that's supposed to be very controlled and very regimented suddenly spun out of control because an unknown vector came into that situation. And so that's what you see in the beginning of Target Acquired. I was fortunate enough. I love Tel Aviv, Israel is one of my favorite places in the world. And I was able to set the book there. And so it starts with Jack Ryan Jr. on loan to the CIA, conducting an asset validation exercise for what's supposed to be a very canned scenario. And as he's doing his part as an evaluator, he sees this knife man who's coming for this woman and her small child. And so he has instant decision to make, do I continue with the asset validation exercise? Do I deviate and interdict this guy? And of course, he deviates and interdicts this guy. And so what starts as something very small spirals into something with global stakes, and that the woman that he saves, he has to figure out who's targeting her and why before she inadvertently unleashes the apocalypse. So small stakes, just a very small storyline, but that's Target Acquired in a nutshell.
Oh man, that's awesome. That is awesome. And then how do you, if I can keep going, if you need me to, I'd love to keep asking. I'm picking this guy's brain.
Go ahead.
Awesome.
Go ahead.
For those that don't know, they got a little bit of your background in that introduction, but by way of background that led up to this and led up to
Sure.
Without Sanction and The Outside Man. What was that? What was that path like for you?
Yeah, so I was, as Chrissy was nice enough to do, to read off my background. I spent 10 years as an Army officer and Apache helicopter pilot, and then a couple of years as an FBI special agent and SWAT team guy. And so certainly there are direct aspects of my background that came into this book, like the asset validation exercise, like some of the things that happen in the climax. But one of the things that has been most beneficial to me is since I got out of the FBI, I spent the ensuing years in my day job working primarily for companies who manufactured and marketed technology to Special Operations Command. And so what that allowed me to do was to rub shoulders, like I said, with some very, very interesting people and hear those stories, which are just incredible, and then provide a vantage point to some of them. So for instance, one of my very good friends who I go to, the opening sequence in Target Acquired, and the prologue has two Green Berets in a hide site that are surveilling a target, and it's a sniper and a spotter. I'm not a sniper and a spotter. I happen to know somebody who might be on this call, but I am not. And so my friend Jason Beefley is a retired sergeant major who served, I think, 12 years with Delta Force. And so I would call him up. I'm like, Jason, here's what I'm trying to do. And then I'd get a class in ballistics and what happens in the Coriolis effect and all that. And so then what you're doing is grabbing hold of that stuff, figuring out what is there that's enough to add veracity to it, and then what is pure storytelling, and you're going to keep it even if the details aren't exactly right, because your job is to tell a great story. And so that's one of the things in my background. I've been lucky enough, in one of my radio interviews for Without Sanction, the radio interview asked me, and she said, "Are you Matt Drake?" And so my protagonist, Matt Drake, is a former member of the Ranger Regiment, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and was a DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency case officer. And she said, "Are you him?" And I said, I am absolutely not him, but I have stood in the same room with him before. And that's true. And that is one of the amazing things about being a writer is the people that you get to rub shoulder with and take bits of their stories and put it into yours. And I'll say this, and I thought you were going to call me on this when you started with my SEAL characterization earlier, but I may have some snarky comments about SEALs and Target Acquired too. And my ultimate dig is that those two snipers that I talked about him, and you may know him, the two Green Berets, one of them is named Jad, and Jad in real life actually is a SEAL. And so I took him, made him a Green Beret, and then talked trash about SEALs. So that's my revenge.
Fantastic. I love it.
Well, we have a few questions that came in. Let's see here. The first one's going to be for Don. Which do you find to be more difficult, writing your own story with your own characters or writing within the existing franchise?
That's a great question. And I'd say they're both challenging for different reasons. So the example that I gave before about making sure I was true to the character's voice. When I'm writing Matt Drake, the only person who knows what Matt Drake sounds like is me. And so I certainly have to at times rewrite scenes or look at pacing or tension, or did it come out the way I want? But I don't have to worry about, am I expressing Matt how he should be expressed? Because again, Matt is somebody I made up. For the Tom Clancy book, there is a legacy to uphold. And I felt that weight, not weight, that's too harsh of a word, that responsibility very acutely, that all of these folks who came before me, including Tom himself, created this amazing thing. And I wanted to do something that was worthy of the universe that they created. And so that has its own set of pressures with it. But at the same time, you also have a lot of things when you're writing a series character, all of the work that's done before him, characters that other people came up with, this universe that Tom Clancy came up with, that you don't have to invent out of whole cloth. Where when I'm writing my own series, all of that I have to come up with. So both are challenging for different reasons, I'd say.
Okay, from Sarah. With all of the Jack Ryan movies out there, do you see one of those actors as Jack Jr.?
That's a good question. I don't, and it's not because there's anything certainly wrong with any of the actors. I think my favorite Jack Ryan Sr. actor, so there haven't been any movies with Jack Ryan Jr., only with Jack Ryan Sr. And I think my favorite two actors are Alec Baldwin in Hunt for the Red October, and then John, starts with a K with a lot of consonants in it. That is the Amazon guy from The Office. I think both of those guys are superb Jack Ryans, but when it comes to Jack Ryan Jr., I don't really have an actor in mind. I did spend a lot of time picking Mark Graney's head on it, and he had this fantastic vision of Jack Ryan Jr. and what he looked like, and his physical build and how he thought and how he did things. And I really just tried to suck everything I could out of Mark Graney's head, and then mine melded into mine, so that when I was writing Jack Ryan Jr., I was writing hopefully in my head and picturing the same guy that Mark Graney was picturing.
And if anyone else has questions, this is the time. Click the button on your screen that says Ask a Question and submit your questions there. This is a question for both of you, and we'll have Jack go first. What is the best thriller you've read this year?
This year, everything blends together so I'm going to take the year out of it, because everything, especially this last year, has just blended together. And things being subjective, I have so many books I love to read. So I have actually every month I pick 6 of them to talk about, and where I was and what I was doing and how they influenced me either as a writer or a combat leader. So those are my website on the blog side of the house. So I tend to go back to those ones because back in the growing up, I really gave them all the time that they deserved, because there were less distractions, and 2, less responsibilities that were tugging at me all the time. So I tend to go back to those ones when I go back and think of some of the ones that gave me that feeling of like, wow, I want to do this one day. Those are the ones that I gravitate back to. So the Brotherhood of the Rose by David Morrell is always one of those ones that always Without Remorse, Tom Clancy, because he has that the origin story for John Clark in there. Read tons of everything by Mark Olden and J.C. Pollock and Stephen Hunter and Nelson DeMille, particularly Charm School. That was the first one that I read. So I love going back and reading all those novels. So if someone's asked me for the ones that are like quote unquote favorites, which I don't really use that term, are those ones that I read growing up, because it was such an unpolluted reading experience and such a wonderful reading experience back then. So that's why I try to get kids into reading as early as possible, because life's going to get in the way pretty soon. And start early. Start that foundation of reading as early as possible. But those are some of the authors that jump to mind that really influenced and impacted me.
Absolutely. And I'm going to talk about 2 that I read recently. So the first one is Sons of Valor by Andrews and Wilson. and it was fantastic. And that book actually comes out tomorrow as well, and I get to do an event with them Wednesday. And it hurt my heart a little bit because they're SEALs, and I didn't want to like them, but I'm teasing about that. It is a fantastic book. It is one of the top 5 military thrillers I've ever read. Like those guys took their tier 1 series and then branched off on it and rebooted it, and it is absolutely fantastic. The second one, there's a guy whose debut is coming out in August, and his name's Taylor Moore, and he wrote a book called Downrange, and it is fantastic. And so he takes kind of the classic military espionage thriller that we've seen a lot of folks writing in, and he turns it on his head some. And so that is another one I'd say, if y'all haven't checked that out yet, he's going to be big. It's his debut. Like I said, I believe it's August. Is also from Emily Bessler, like Jack is, and it is a great book. So those are 2 that I've read. And then Chrissy, if we have more questions and stuff, that's awesome. Happy to answer them. But before we go, I also want to get Jack to tell us what's going on with Terminal List and Chris Pratt and all the cool stuff in California.
All right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot going on out there. So they're right in the middle of filming the series. So 8-part series for Amazon. Chris is crushing it. Like, I had high expectations, and he's exceeding all those expectations. Constance Wu also, I had such high expectations. She is blowing those expectations
Awesome.
out of the water. Taylor Kitsch saying what an amazing guy, amazing actor.
Texas forever.
That's it, man. That's it. Number 33. So yeah, absolutely. What a great guy. And so to see all these people working, but my biggest takeaway from being on set is how hard everybody works out there at every level. At every single level, everyone is all in all the time, all day, every day. From the outside looking in, even me before, I was like, oh, Hollywood, it's fun. You show up and you make believe, you pretend and you blow stuff up. Yeah, you do that. But to get to that stage, there's a lot that happens. And as a viewer, or as a critic even, you don't see that side of it. You don't see how much from the key grip to the mobility transportation person to the stunt coordinator to the actors to everybody else in between to the craft food service people. Like, everybody out there is pouring their heart and souls into this thing, and so that's incredible to see. I hadn't really thought about that before I was on set, and now that I've been on a few times, spent a few weeks out there, I see that every time I walk away so impressed by just how hard everybody works out there. But
that's
yeah,
awesome.
It's cool. It's cool and coming sometime in 2022. So we'll see.
Wow.
That's
Is Chris
amazing, dude.
Pratt an executive producer on that too?
Yep, yeah, there's a few of us. So it's me, him, and Antoine Fuqua are the executive producers on it, and Antoine, oh my gosh, what an incredible guy! Like, when you're in presence of someone where you're just like, oh, there's something different about this person. Like, that's him, and wow, what an incredible director! Not just incredible director, but incredible person. So can't say enough good things, great things about him as well. What a great guy. Amazing.
Can you talk a little bit about your role in that? Because I know you're doing the writing for it as well, and just I know tons of people are curious about that. And so if it's all right, can you give kind of a thumbnail sketch of that?
Yep. So I advise on all the scripts, but there are different writers for each episode, and then there's a showrunner who's the overall kind of vision and does a lot of the things that a director would do for a motion picture, but for a series, they're kind of the puppet master, and they're kind of coordinating all this chaos. So him and I put the first episode together, and
cool.
He took it with Chris and Antoine, and they walked it around, went to Netflix and to Amazon and to Apple and to Showtime and all these different companies, and then they had this bidding war happen, and then it ended up at Amazon, and then from there it gets like an influx of capital, and then they bring in a writer's room. So then you have like 15 people that go over this story arc for a series, and then it gets divvied up. And each one of them gets kind of an episode to work on, and then they go off to their projects, and then it goes back to a couple screenwriters and the showrunner and me, and then we get to tweak it and move things around, and then Antoine sees it and Chris sees it, and now with Amazon everything goes up to Amazon and then comes back down with show notes. So that's been really interesting. So it's been really cool to be part of that process. And usually they like to get rid of the author, from what I hear, so you're not on set. But for me, being like a student of this my whole life, both in watching and or reading novels and then watching those novels adapted to either television or film, and understanding that there is a difference when you tell a story visually. So I went into that knowing that it was going to be different, expecting it to be different and to have changes made, and for that to be okay. Like if you read the book First Blood by David Morrell, came out in 1972, never been out of print since, and watch the movie First Blood with Sylvester Stallone. Well, those are two very different things, but both fantastic in their own right. So that's really what I want for this, and that's what Antoine and what Chris wanted, was to keep the darkness, keep the authenticity, keep the realism. And keep that to the series, the violence, keep that part and be true to that, knowing that if you're telling this story in an 8-part series, that things will change. And so for me, it's been an incredible experience, an incredible journey, and I can't wait for people to see it. I think, Chris is gonna literally and figuratively blow people away.
That's awesome, dude.
All right, we have a question in the chat for both. Do either of you ever write with audiobook narration in mind?
I can go because I thought about this recently.
No, you go because I know you have a story for this, so please do.
Oh, well, no, I mean, I recently thought about this just in conversations that I have with Ray Porter, who narrates my series, and I didn't before, but now getting to know him and becoming good friends with him, now I think about that a little bit, and now I think about some of the other options and opportunities that are out there with, let's say, an Audible or that sort of a thing, because it's the fastest growing segment of publishing. People love it. I think the podcast listeners are also audiobook listeners, that sort of a thing. There's a lot you can do with it that hasn't been done with on the audio side of the house yet, because up to this point, it's someone reading a book. There's some other things that can be incorporated. There's some technology that's evolved since cassette tapes and CDs, so I'm excited to dive into that stuff a little more. So I'm starting to think about that a little more as I write, and I haven't up to this point. But and then I do think about Ray Porter having to figure out how to say these names, how to say an accent. How to come up with something. Do you say nods or do you say NODADSs? Like, what do you say when you're doing these things? So now I'm starting to think about that a little more going forward.
Yeah, I guess where I was going to go with this, and I thought I'd heard you say the same thing, is that Ray Porter is famous for narrating a whole bunch of fantastic books. And one of the series he does is with Jonathan Mayberry, who's a great writer that does a number of horror and science fiction. And so Jonathan Mayberry has this really cool series. The first one's called Patient Zero. That's kind of a mix between a military thriller and a vampire book. And I remember reading an article that Jonathan Mayberry did saying that Ray Porter has narrated so many of his books now that when he writes, he hears Ray's voice in his head, and it actually affects his writing process. And so I didn't know if you had gotten to that point with him or not, Jack, because I know you guys had some great success as well together. But I have not, from my perspective, audiobooks aren't something that I really, from a media perspective, aren't something that I did beforehand. I love just the written word and never really listened to audiobooks before. So it wasn't as big a part or a big influence on me from a writing perspective. It's starting to get more that way because, like Jack said, the Audible market in general, and even the straight to Audible market now, is huge. But it's always fascinating to hear things like what Jonathan Mayberry said about hearing Ray Porter's voice in his mind as he's writing now, because those two things are so fused for him.
Jonathan Mayberry, I don't know if you know, he lived in our area. We were his hometown bookstore before he moved out to the West Coast. We just did an event with him in April for Independent Bookstore Day with Ray, and they were talking about this exact thing, how he always has him in mind when he's writing.
So I got my MFA at Seton Hill University, which is in Pennsylvania as well. And so Jonathan Mayberry actually came and was one of the guest speakers there. And so he's a great, super nice guy, but he's a big mountain of a man. Like, he had been, I guess, a bouncer at one point and everything else. And he's a fascinating guy, a great author and a fantastic speaker.
Mm-hmm. All right. So we have a question from John here. He was able to get his hands on your arc of Target Acquired. He said he was sort of dubious when the female character didn't know why she was being attacked. please let me know your thoughts here.
Because he was dubious. Here's what I'll say is, I hope the book worked for you and you enjoyed it. Sometimes certain things work for certain folks and don't work for other folks. So hope you stop being dubious after you read it, but if you didn't, that's fine too. So I appreciate you reading.
And our last question here, for both of you, and we'll have Jack go first. How did COVID affect the publication process in the past year, or year and a half, really?
Oh yeah, it was crazy. So my third novel, Savage Son, came out in April of 2020. So up to that point, so there hadn't been too many books published like at the height of COVID, and that was kind of the height. When I say height, I mean kind of the height of uncertainty. It seemed like anyway, health-wise, financially for a lot of people, wondering if they're going to have jobs going forward, or if things are going to shut down for a year, for a month, 6 months. We just didn't know a lot of things back then. So it was a very uncertain time to launch a book, and Simon & Schuster couldn't say, the last time we launched during a pandemic, this is what worked, this is what didn't. Like, there was nothing. Yeah, there was nothing to go back to. And I had to pivot essentially on a dime, although I did see it coming. So I started to prep back in late January. So I started to prep certainly in February, definitely in March, prep to not do a book tour, to look at what assets were out there that were not available to authors in 1975, 85, 95 that I could use to help launch this book during a time when you can't go to a bookstore and things are shut down and things are uncertain. So how do you shift the focus of your interview, especially at a time when people are uncertain about their health and about finances, and then you're saying, hey, here's my book. So framing it differently, talking about preparedness, some of those other things I could bring in from my background to talk about in interviews to make it appropriate. It was very important to me to launch that book in an appropriate way during a time that was very uncertain. So shifting during that, and then writing the next book during a time with the kids in the house. That's the part that was the most insane. Especially like this last one was so research intensive for The Devil's Hand, because the other ones I had all sorts of touch points with, and I'm going back and I'm doing research just to confirm a lot of things. This one I had no touch points really with bioweapons, that sort of a thing. So I had to do a lot of research to make sure that I got that part of it right. So I had to interview a lot of people, and most all of that was virtual. Then I had to take what they said and check that. So I had to kind of do a journalist's job on that side of the house. So that took a ton of time. And when you're locked inside with the family right there helping, it's an interesting writing experience. So it was interesting to launch a book during that time frame, and also to write another one during that time frame. So hopefully next year, 2022, when the next book comes in, things will have opened up a little bit more, and it won't be as insane to either write or launch a novel.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you get a chance to finally launch your book, your debut novel. So my debut novel was Without Sanction, for my Matt Drake series. And that is the most exciting and also the most terrifying time of your life, because you probably, written a bunch of books that didn't sell perhaps, or at least you've worked a long time of it, and it's your book baby is finally going into the wild. And so you're trying to figure out what is normal, what's not normal, am I doing well? Am I not doing well? And so I had all of that, and I got the great fortune to launch in March, right in the middle of when the COVID lockdown happened. And so I was luckier than a lot of my fellow debut writers who debuted last year. And then I got to do some of my book tour and got to see people and have a lot of the things that are fun about being a writer before the lockdown happened and we couldn't travel anymore. But it was still very much kind of like what Jack said, from a writing perspective or a business perspective. It was still a whole lot of uncertainty, because you don't know how you're doing or not. Anyway, when you're a debut writer, you're trying to figure all that out, and you add all the uncertainty of COVID and what's happening and not happening and that kind of thing. Now, what happened after that is I was very, very fortunate, and then I was one of the lucky few in that my day job wasn't affected a whole lot, other than I didn't travel as much as I normally did for my day job, and my whole family was home, kind of as Jack was alluding to. And so writing the book was a little bit more challenging during COVID, just because of You know, the same thing that everybody on this call had to deal with. But man, compared to what a lot of folks went through, losing their jobs, having loved ones affected, stuff like that, I've got nothing to complain about at all.
All about that perspective, huh?
Absolutely.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you both for joining us tonight. I'd like to remind everyone watching that you can click the button on your screen that says buy the books to purchase either The Devil's Hand or Tom Clancy Target Acquired, or both, which I recommend. The first 50 people to buy Target Acquired will get a book plate signed by Don Bentley. Don, I want to tell you that John circled back and he did love the book, although he was dubious.
That's good. That's good.
And thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. This was a really good time. And thank you, everyone, for watching. And good luck with the rest of your tour.
Thank you so much, Chrissy and Jack. I really appreciate you making time for this, man.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. And congratulations. I'm fired up for
Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thanks.
Thank you
Awesome.
so
See y'all
much,
later.
everyone. Have a good night.
Bye.